As I say, I've just written it all down, so I'll just read it aloud, and then you can kind of interrupt if it jumps too much or something like that. Anyhow, hello. In this talk, I want to address what a politics of revelation can be, has been, and why it is worthy of our attention. Even though we in modern parlance tend to separate the political from the religious, the two are inseparably connected to times of upheavals. The specific kind of revelatory politics I want to address here today is a peculiar brand of grandiose politics, historically related to the New Left, but informed as much by speculations, dreams, and wild desires as by any kind of realist politics. It is a politics that wants to both reorient life and reorganize society by combining religious and political forces, since any revolution in human affairs, as already Tocqueville observed, has to be both religious and political. It has to be a project of world transformation that entails both a change in consciousness and a change in institutions. Due to this double lineage, bridging the chasm between inner and outer states, as much as this type of politics is about social transformation, revolt and revolution, it is about what the alchemists of yore called the great work, which transforms not only base metals, but also the self. It is concerned with revolution in the head, but it still dreams of smashing the system. To begin with, I would like to draw attention to the Scottish situationist and beat writer Alexander Trocchi. In the early 1960s, Trocchi left art and literature behind in order to become a sigmanaut, a self-proclaimed cosmonaut of inner space, primarily inspired by sodomy, as he declared at the Edinburgh Literary Festival in 1962. Trocchi's new project, beyond art and politics to a certain extent, was the Sigma Project, which would instead ignite an invisible insurrection of a million minds, and by this, and through the creation of a string of so-called action universities, he would instigate a cultural takeover of the world. To do this, Trocchi stated in his first Sigma Manifesto, a revolutionary proposal, what was needed was a revelation. Trocchi worked in continuation of the modernist artistic avant-garde movements, which wanted to make projects instead of masterpieces. These projects of biological and social engineering should elaborate a vision of a future human type apt to exist under unprecedented conditions. Present man was obsolete. Due to a feeling of being on the brink of something completely new, which was necessary in order to survive, the Sigmanauts were concerned with not only the total destruction of the existing system, but also a total rejection of its social, material, and spiritual values. Thus, while reformulating radical politics for the post-war generation with improvisational tactics, they applied the same tactics to an often Gnostic spirituality. The imagined future would consist not only of associations of free men working with the means of production held in common, but also of the dissociation of ritual from belief, where the former is instrumentalized to create community by collectively expanding the limits of the self. The tendency to bridge the gap between inner and outer through combining political theory with a type of radical psychiatry is conspicuous in the 1960s counterculture in general, where psychic emancipation was explicitly associated with social liberation, which, along the way, fueled an occult revival. Magic is the superstructure, as the British anti-psychiatrist Audie Lane said. The esoteric was understood as a point where artistic, scientific, and spiritual knowledge converged, and where the engagement with occult ideas, on the one hand, was a new mode of thinking, and on the other, an experience of transmutation. Occultism has always had its allure in counterculture. Big theories have a tendency to break out when everyday routines, as well as social and intellectual practices, come under pressure, and it becomes vital to rethink or reinvent oneself. The occult is thus always an awakening, a revitalization movement, ghost dance as a reaction to failed revolutions. But, like anarchism, it is a double-edged sword in that it spans the political spectrum. At its most radical and illuminating, the turn towards the occult is a transgressive act. It challenges the power of institution, degrades the psychic oppression of entrenched systems, and provides individuals with direct and unmediated access to an experiential way of being in the immediate now. In this sense, occultism is psychedelic, mystical, and liberating all at once. But as we again are seeing the rise of fascist forces and strongman politics around the world, maybe due to a peculiar contemporary overlap between myths, fictionalizations, and lived reality, it might also be a timely reminder that many of the aesthetic concerns we discuss when talking about a type of magico-politics occurred for the first time around the rise of European fascism. Since Eliphas Lévy constructed it, the occult has taken shape of a theology of self-creation where subjectivity can be programmed and deprogrammed through fictions. This makes it fundamentally ambiguous as a technique, since it can be utilized by ideologies radically opposed on the political spectrum. One of the most conspicuous strains of occultism in the countercultural spirituality, besides the one from Blavatsky and Theosophy, descends from the teachings of Aleister Crowley, who created his system primarily based on his experiences as a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Even though Crowley, mountaineer, poet, and occultist, became very influential in the 1960s, like Sgt. Pepper and all that kind of stuff, it is important to stress that the influence was more occultural than occult proper, since it found a home among patchwork cults and collectives who read Crowley side by side with Marx, the weird tales of H.P. Lovecraft, and other pulp fiction cosmologies. What was needed was a plunge into the unknown, and the artist's mission was to provide context and structure for future events. These events would ideally create the revelation, an awakening that would raise the audience awareness from passive spectators to active participants and co-producers of the cultural moment. In this understanding, the spiritual in the new spirituality is merely that which is beyond the individual, and in which name it is possible to experience an existence beyond the self. That's actually Bataille that I'm taking that from, that the spiritual is that which is beyond the individual. Anyhow, the aim is not unification with God, but unification with the social. An early predecessor to Trocchi's politics of revelation can be found in the medieval heretical movements like the Anabaptists and the Brethren of the Free Spirit. But in more modern times, we find these ideas again in especially Surrealism. Surrealism also had and has both an esoteric and an exoteric side. It called for a new marvelous myth that evolved from a loosely defined communism in the late 1920s, where the Parisian group for a period aligned itself with Marxism and the Communist Party, to the more occulted anarchist stand of the 1950s. All along, it was drawing on a wide range of sources and predecessors, spanning the spectrum from political prophecy and poetic language to alchemy and voodoo. The founder of Surrealism, André Breton, wrote in his Prolegomena to a third manifesto, or Prolegomena or to a third manifesto, or not, about this new myth, which, not unlike Chaucer's social myth, consisted of images meant to inspire and inflame in the here and now, and asked, and I quote, "In what measure can we choose and adapt and impose a myth fostering the society that we judge to be desirable?" End of quote. This myth should be the origin myth of new patterns of behavior and new social arrangements. It would not be the personal myth of an artist, but collective myths able to emancipate man, myths to challenge and change the world, making us all into prophets and visionaries along the way by enabling us automatic access to the unconscious, and thus make us into something that exceeds who and what we are and sets us on a mutable path of human becoming. It was a call for social, political, and cultural revolution that originates in the inner self of the individual and echoes across the 20th century into our contemporary in the form of this kind of hope of a secular religion of the future that can sort of like work as social glue, which is immanent, it's acephalous, it's non-transcendent, and it's often inspired by the Prisca Theologica of Hermeticism and its religion of the mind. The goal of Hermeticism and alchemy was not to gain access to another world beyond the individual. It was about perfecting what is already here through a process of analyzing and reassembling, solve e coagula. The emphasis in surrealism thus gradually shifted from experimentation with the releases of unconscious material to a call to consciously transform reality through unconscious inspiration. By exchanging political terms with mythological ones, paths were open towards new ways of conceptualizing and acting in the here and now. One of the key influences in how to make it happen was one of the people participating in Trocchi's Sigma project, the writer William Burroughs, who in turn himself was heavily inspired by surrealism. In the 1960s, Burroughs and his co-conspirator Brian Gysin, a former surrealist, wanted to create a new mythology for the space age. In order to will mutation into existence, Gysin and Burroughs perfected the cut-up method as the art and science of causing change to occur in conformity with the will, which happens to be Aleister Crowley's famous definition of magic from his introduction to Magic in Theory and Practice. The basic idea is drawn from the surrealists that it becomes possible to create a revelation through juxtapositions, an artistic equivalent of throwing the I Ching, which eludes not only the cult of genius, but human intervention in general. Invisible forces speak through the producer and provide the type of insights said to reveal themselves in hypnagogic states. The logic behind the cut-up is that since reality largely consists of fictions, it can be manipulated by manipulating its depictions. This point of view results in the conviction that reality consists solely of the narratives we use to comprehend it, and that by creating new narratives and anti-narratives, we open up the possibility of creating and manipulating that very reality. By cutting up familiar lines of association, we can reassemble another world. Subjectivity itself is a fiction. We are free to create ourselves with no fixed identity or vocation. Like religion, fiction is no longer a tradition we inherit. Both have been multiplied by secularization and are now biopolitically controlled by the barrage of images around us, where we, in return for relinquishing control, are given the opportunity to fictionalize and religionize freely in a process where we form as much as we express. For the surrealists and the counterculture, the way to do this, to reassemble this other world, this new world, was to cut up what was already there and juxtapose it in new and surprising ways to create a revelation that would jolt us out of consensus reality and expand our minds to include a more magical and mythical way of thinking. Myths are inextricably linked to language, poetry, and art. It forms the epic element of any community, whereas rites forms the dramatic. By analyzing the latter, the form can be understood. Because myth, in line with art and poetry, is a symbolic form, it can make everything look like everything else. This results in that, on the one hand, no precise definition of myth can be established, and, on the other, that mythical thinking is based on magical thinking. Unlike the rational project of the Enlightenment, with its search for cause and effect, magical thinking operates within a framework of similarity. Myth is capable of uniting opposites and gather disparate elements into a single entity, where art provides an intuitive entity and science a cognitive entity. Myth unites feelings. It cannot be reduced to pure emotion because it is always the expression of feelings. It is feelings in the form of an image. Narratives thus become a terrain of political fictionalization, social myths that want something to happen. Control, as William Burroughs would have called it, operates through these image myths, and to question the myths of the ruling classes is always a form of resistance. It becomes a form of media-driven viral meme magic that distinguishes itself from earlier magical traditions by operating as a form of postmodern chaos magic. DIY ethics rule, one uses what is at hand, preferably the imagery of popular culture, instead of more ceremonial measures and long-winded rituals. Magical cultures have always been exercises in fictioning, mythopoetic tangents that produce new beliefs from arcane sources. This does not mean that they're any less real or functional. What aligns magic with the political is that it is about the raising of energies and directing them towards a goal with the intention to create change. As such, magic is a speculative and experimental technique to challenge consensus reality and dominant regimes of subjectivity. It is based on failure and operates by juxtaposing heterogeneous elements to see what happens. It is fundamentally surreal, since it is precisely in the meeting of different terrains that revelations and the new can occur. It is an opening to the unknown, whether this is seen as the unconscious, a realm of the dead, or something extraterrestrial. Since it is a form of fictionalization, it shares the world-creating and world-building potential of fiction. World-building is another way of saying that one of the most effective ways of treating the world today and or the role of humanity in it is to assume that everything is a complete fiction. Empowerment is thus about gaining the opportunity to rewrite the script and or actively produce new meaning. In this light, we can see initiatives from the counterculture, such as Trocchi's Sigma Project, Burroughs' attempt to create an Academy 23, or Timothy Leary's and Robert Anton Wilson's Cosmic Futurism, as alchemical attempts at manufacturing the Philosopher's Stone, the key to the kingdom of God, where we are all living in joy and abundance, through revelation. Visita interiora terrae rectificando qui venis occultum labidem, as the alchemists put it in the famous vitriol sentence, visit the innermost earth, and by rectifying it, you will find the hidden stone. Creating the Philosopher's Stone was equivalent to liberating the mind and let loose the imagination, but not as escapism. The occult aesthetics becomes an egress from the image politics of power by carrying a utopian hope that through the experience of transmutation, there is another path to an unknown future, created by correspondences between inner and outer representation and reality, where men still have a free will to choose their own destiny and become a new type of collective individual. Traditionally, when we talk about utopia in the future, we're thinking about the world to come as a question of organization. But utopia is not only a place, it is also a method of imagining schemes, spaces, objects that through the power of fantasy and desire inspire change in the real world. As a way to conclude, I would like to return to the beginning, where I said that Trocchi's aim in calling for a revelation was to ignite an invisible insurrection of a million minds. The term insurrection might be key to a better understanding of the politics behind this drive, as insurrectionary attempts often are more concerned with obtaining autonomy than obtaining political power. The insurrection is to a large degree aimed at one's own self-transformation. It becomes an affirmation of the singularity of the individual and its power to transcend external circumstances. This micropolitical transformation of the self in relation to power is thus a withdrawal from the ruling systems of power and our dependency upon them, where the goal of the political revolution is to emancipate people from political power, and where the risk is high that one form of power will replace another. The insurrection seeks to create the individual's own freedom. By reclaiming itself, it becomes capable of reclaiming its autonomy. The invisible insurrection and its politics of revelation is thus more related to self-transformation and hidden correspondences than to any party program or revolutionary event. Thank you.
We have some time for questions. Would you like to ask?
It was a great talk, and there's many sort of interesting things. I just sort of wondered if you would if you would see connections between any sort of contemporary phenomena and some of the historical things that you talked about, like surrealism and the things that were going on in the 60s. And I was sort of struck by your language towards the end, but it sounded very similar to something like the Invisible Committee, who also speak of a coming insurrection, and sort of using these kind of similar terms. And certainly I know that there's links between, there's certainly inspiration from them from people like Situationists and so forth. So I just wondered if you sort of see, or perhaps you point to other contemporary phenomena that, that are continuing with.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, I mean, obviously it's totally alive in popular culture. In the underground, I think it's tending to be a bit more sort of separated, where, I mean, obviously sort of like the Invisible Committee, they're coming from the sort of post-anarchist stand where they are drawing on situationism, but they don't really have sort of like an artistic wing or something like that. Whereas, I mean, surrealism had both a political and an artistic wing, and I mean, some of the countercultural attempts most definitely had both a political and a artistic wing that was sort of like united, where surrealism could be the sort of like forebearer, but I mean also with, for example, the Psychic TV and the Temple of Psychic Youth, where you have that sort of like a propaganda wing and a more ideological wing that use cultural production as the battle terrain. Regarding more contemporary, I think to a certain extent, a lot of these things they're having sort of a moment where they are a new renewed interest in him. Both surrealism, with all the surrealist women, they're getting new receptions these years. The occult, where we have some sort of at least pop occult revival. I'm not sure whether it's ceremonial magic or whether it's just sort of like witches of Instagram and this sort of like the occult as stafars, as like sort of like black metal aesthetics or something. But I think a lot of it, where it's not maybe as united as it maybe used to be pre-internet or whatever you want to sort of like be nostalgic about, like a more sort of identifiable counterculture. A lot of these seeds are sort of brewing. I have a feeling of, right, in various kind of attempts at reformulating another relation to the self or to nature, all these kind of things. It's not as, I mean, you could also see it with sort of like the Occupy movement, where some of the people, they became like radical witches going on the streets and protesting and using like witch from the 60s, what are they called, like women terrorists, international terrorist conspiracy from hell, and using that kind of imagery in order to protest in a more sort of like political way. But I don't know, to a certain extent, I think that a lot of the ways we used to conceptualize art, politics, and the occult needs to be sort of reformulated, because to a certain extent the world is turned upside down. So I think if we're using the analytical tools we used like 20, 30 years ago, we're actually talking reversed values to a certain extent, so it's also this sort of, maybe the demarcation between left and right is a bit more sort of fluid than it has been for many years, right? What is what, and these people, if they're talking about, for example, a new relation to nature, it's conservatism, and you're automatically part of the new right instead of reclaiming it for some sort of left project. You know what I mean? So I think it's kind of a thin ice to talk about a lot of the ideologies there, because they're kind of fluid, right? Sort of like identity can be fluid, right? It's not as polarized today, I think, ideologically, as it used to be. Fairly easier to find out if people there were reading Marx or not. You know what I mean? I don't know. What's that question over here?
That's probably one question. One quick question.
It's more just to continue that conversation, because you said it's not as polarized, and I think you're right. When you bring it down to individual cases, actually, the whole left-right thing is not as useful.
No, we need new tools to analyze it, right?
But still, there's a sense of culture war, and within that culture war, there is a sense of there being radically polarized, esoteric revolutionaries. You think about the meme war and the kind of people that do align more with new right and stuff.
I think in that it's also that the extremes have become more sort of naturalized. That the extremes have become more sort of center to a certain extent, right? Where I mean, the politics is. I think actually do think, that's also why I think that it's necessary to think through politics and art and the occult and spirituality and all these kind of things, because we need to sort of develop new tools to actually analyze the contemporary condition. But I think there's also this sort of normalization of extreme discourses that has happened, where they're becoming way more normal, but at the same time also slightly less demarcated than they used to be, right? That some of these values have become either reversed or superfluid, you know. And I find it actually very interesting, for example, about the relation to nature and landscape, for example, whether that is something that's part of the new right, or whether that's something that can be sort of, I mean, if you go to a psychogeographical track to Stonehenge, does that make you a fascist? You know what I mean? And because it didn't in the 80s and 90s. No, but there's that kind of thing also where the occult itself is tainted with a kind of conservatism, right, where it's easily reclaimable for the right.
Yeah, all the vegan right-wingers as well, and you know, some things that used to be obvious markers are now no longer obvious.
It used to be obvious markers for a leftist project in the counterculture. But that's also what I mean with that in the contemporary condition. It's my feeling that a lot of these values have been reversed to a certain extent, which is why we sort of need to get on par analytically, right, with the contemporary condition, and hopefully we can get a bit there through analyzing the past or kind of the historical avant-garde or counterculture or cult revivals and all that kind of stuff, which basically is what we're talking about here as well, right?
Sure. That's it.
Cool.
Thank you very much.